get my screen. I've got 2 stories for you all tonight. First one is called Among the Wildflowers, as written by Jordan Collerman. There was a patch of wildflowers growing outside the funeral home, and they were just perfect. A ray of morning sun filtered down through the trees and lit them like a spotlight, their delicate purple blossoms a sharp contrast against the deep green of the grass. 8-year-old Jacob broke away from the crowd that was milling about out front to inspect them more closely. They were all beautiful, but one in particular stood out from the rest, its petals lush and vibrant. Jacob plucked it carefully and held it gently by the stem as he looked out at the sea of black-garbed mourners waiting to be let inside. He spotted her at the far end of the lawn. She was with her family, entertaining her baby sister while her parents stood nearby, engrossed in grown-up conversation with another group of adults. Her coppery hair swooped down the back of her brand-new black dress in a long braided ponytail. Her green eyes sparkled in the sun as she made funny faces for her clapping sister in the stroller, and she was laughing. Jacob could hear her laughing all the way across the lawn, bright and silvery. It made his chest ache. His grandpa walked up beside him, wearing his funny old suit that smelled like mothballs, and he put a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "I was in love once, too," his grandpa said, "with Miss DeWitt, if you can believe it." Jacob had never met Miss DeWitt, only knew her as the old lady who lived in the big house on the hill. But it seemed she had been popular. Practically the entire town had showed up for her funeral. "I wasn't much older than you are now," his grandpa continued. "She was just Millie then. We were in band class together. She played the flute, and I played the trumpet. And we sat across that big band room from each other all year. She looked so pretty when she played, like an angel. I'd get distracted watching her, and every now and then I'd catch her staring at me from across the room. When she saw me looking, she'd cross her eyes and stick out her tongue to make me laugh. Once, just once, I got to play a solo. And when I'd finished, she stood up and clapped like I'd been performing at Carnegie Hall. But she was popular and rich, and just about everyone in school had a crush on her. I don't think I ever said a single word to her." His grandpa trailed off, a faraway look in his eyes, until movement in the crowd snapped him out of his reverie. "Looks like they're letting us folks in, kiddo," he said. "Let's go get in line." Jacob followed his grandfather, still cradling the flower he had picked, and they joined the line of people queuing up to get inside. He craned his neck, looking up and down the line for a flash of coppery red, but he had lost sight of her as they all trudged slowly around the border of the lawn. An old woman in line behind them was speaking to her new friend in a low voice. Jacob tried not to eavesdrop, but he couldn't help but overhearing. "It was the time period," the old woman said. "Otherwise, I might have said something. There was a party one night at Dan Stanton's house. A bunch of us teenagers doing what teenagers do and playing 7 Minutes in Heaven. It was high school, so I hadn't figured it out just yet. But somehow, I think Millie knew. We were all in a big circle, drawing names out of a hat to see who went in next. I was almost in tears. The thought of walking into that cramped closet with a strange boy and being expected to know what to do was terrifying. I tried to hide it, but Millie saw. I could see it in her eyes. She was beautiful, of course, but she had such kind eyes. I thought she felt bad for me. When my name was called, I went numb all over. I walked into the closet and sat there, trembling, hoping it'd be over soon. But when the door opened, it wasn't some unfamiliar boy. It was Millie. She sat on the floor with me and held me as I cried, running her fingers through my hair and whispering to me that it was okay, that it would all be okay. She smelled like lavender and honey. When I calmed down, she took my face in her hands and kissed me once, softly. Then she got up and walked out. I went home shortly after, and we never mentioned it again. The old woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sometimes I still wonder. Jacob followed his grandpa up to the front steps through the doorway. It was dark and cool as they found their seats. Pre-recorded organ music played over the somber murmurs of a conversation. Upon the dais, surrounded by bouquets of flowers, lay the casket. Jacob had never seen a dead body before. He could only see a bit of Miss DeWitt's face from where he sat, but she looked like any other old lady to him. She might have been napping. He set the small purple flower in his lap, careful not to bend any of its petals. Every seat was taken, and now the last few stragglers were making their way in to stand against the back wall. Jacob searched for any signs of red hair and green eyes, but there were too many people. Just across the aisle from him, old Mr. Keller sat with his head bowed. He was a big man, loud and funny. Jacob knew he was important because everyone always talked about how many companies he owned. But today, Mr. Keller looked tired. Jacob could hear him as he spoke quietly down at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap. She told me the baby was mine, begged me to stay, but I couldn't. Lord, I was young and scared. I wanted what I wanted, so I left. And when I finally came back, it had been too long. I couldn't face her. I couldn't bear to, and now it's too late. I think she gave up the baby, but I don't want to know. I just don't want to know. Jacob looked away, feeling like he had heard something he shouldn't. The music changed and the crowd went silent as the pastor entered and addressed them from the podium. Everyone stood up and sang, then sat down and prayed. The pastor said some nice words about Miss DeWitt, and how she was always kind and generous, beautiful inside and out, how she was a pillar of the community, and how sad it was that he had lived by herself for so many years in that great big house. But also how it was okay, because she was with God now. Jacob listened, and as he did, he saw Mr. Keller crying quietly, tears running down his big red face into his lap. He saw the woman from the line blowing her nose into her handkerchief, and he saw his grandpa staring at nothing with that same faraway look in his eyes. Jacob waited until everyone bowed their heads in silent prayer, then slid out of his seat and walked quietly towards the dais. He wasn't afraid. As he walked up the carpet steps, he could see her clearly now. Millie DeWitt, lay peacefully in the casket, her hands resting on her stomach. Even though she was old, Jacob thought she looked very pretty and a little sad. Gently, he laid his purple flower down on her chest. The color of it matched the flowers of her dress. Then he turned and walked down the steps, down the aisle, and out the door. Everyone was looking at him, but he did not care. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he caught a glimpse of red hair and green eyes, watching him go. But he kept walking. She would see him outside. He would be waiting for her. But first, he had another flower to pick. That was Among the Wildflowers, as written by Jordan Collerman. We will take a few moments so I can get a quick drink. And I see more folks have arrived. I can't... Wow, a whole bunch more people are here now. Welcome all. Give me just a moment. Let me grab a drink. And we will continue on to the next one, which I feel is a very fun story. That's better. There's a hamburger at my feet. I think it's just safe to say we all look a little strange in VR chat. I would expect that. I don't think you're a 1.5 foot tall, cat-eared, small female. This is true, but it'd be a bit difficult to, drive. Okay. All right. No, I see the clone trooper. All right. All right. So for the next story, title's a little hard to read, so I'm just going to spell it. Title of this story is ALN23061912RK. As soon as I find my mouse cursor. There we go. Nope. Scoot into the cuddle pile. And this is written by a Cindy Reeds. Something wasn't right. The farmer's market buzzed around him, his arms heavy with cloth totes filled to the brim. There had been a lovely selection of candles this morning. Now he waited amongst the sea of humanity in the square for the curly-haired vendor to wrap up his fresh-cut flowers. An acoustic band played in the middle of the market, twangy notes bouncing off tents and muddled with the voice of the crowd. He reached out for his wrapped bouquet with a smile while alarm bells rang in his head. It seemed like a pleasant day from all the available information. It was. Yet every time he turned a corner, every time he bumped into someone, and mumbled his apologies. He felt as if eyes were burning into the back of his skull. He checked his breath rate, found it functioning normally. He tested his blinking mod and found no concerns. Still, as he weaved through the market, he zoned in on the porta-johns and stood in line calmly as he could. When he finally made it inside, he closed his eyes and scanned. No function seemed abnormal. Still, with his sensory circuits firing so much today, he decided it best to do a soft reboot. Candles heavy in his arms, the flowers peeking over the side of his totes, he stood still in the porta-john and let his CPU reset. A few functions stuttered at first, mostly the modifications he'd added in the last few years, like the blinking mod. After a second or two, they all hummed quietly into order, evening out their memory usage. Response time under a second. Respiratory simulation at a resting rate of 14 breaths a minute. Blinking mod pushing a blink every 7 seconds. Nothing out of order. He let his shoulders relax and flushed the toilet behind him. There'd be no way to differentiate him from anyone else. Couldn't be. He exited the porta-john and tried to push the feelings away. Maybe it was time to leave the market. He headed down the street at a leisurely pace, careful not to seem in a hurry. After all, if for some reason it wasn't his sensory awareness misfiring, it'd be best not to appear paranoid. There'd be no reason for a man visiting the farmer's market on a beautiful morning to think he was being followed. Even in this train of thought, he reassured himself that being followed wasn't likely. Why let it ruin his day? Whether to throw off his pursuers or to force himself to abandon the silly thoughts, he took a detour on the way back to his apartment. He stopped in at the local gardening center, where the shopkeep knew him by his fake name, and bought a new spider plant. Now, his arms and hands full, he walked a little quicker towards his complex. He told himself it was to get the snake plant inside, but he knew fear chased his footsteps. The doorman greeted him as he stepped through the door. He nodded once, snake plant's hanging leaves jostling as he pulled out his resident card. Only when walking up the stairs to his third-floor studio did he relax. His neighbor, Mrs. Whistledown, waved in the hallway. He smiled and greeted her as he shuffled his things to unlock the door. Once inside, he let the totes fall to the ground and set the snake plant on the windowsill. He then leaned against the wall and put his head in his hands. The alarm bells were quieter now that he was on the inside, locked in and safe. His apartment complex was the safest place he could be. So why were the alarms only quieter and not gone? Something at the market must have been off in a way that his logic systems had found dangerous. It would take hours to sift through the raw data to find what he had triggered it. Hours of audio, video, all having to be sifted through to find what had gone wrong. He looked at his apartment and sighed. He wouldn't be able to go into rest mode until he had found it. He knew that. With a heavy dose of trepidation, he started the script to find the trigger. While the script ran, he unloaded his haul from the farmer's market. He picked a purple candle and placed it on his dining table, stacking the others careful towers in his closet. He unwrapped the bouquet, grabbing a packet of plant food from his cabinet and a vase. He filled the vase with water and mixed in the food and arranged the flowers. He then grabbed his watering can and sprayer and set to watering his plants. First, the rubber plant, Henry. Henry needed a good misting during the warm months, and he obliged, spraying each leaf evenly. Then Alberta, the Boston fern. Next were the lavender and mint pots, lilac and pepper. And down the line he went, each plant with a different name, both scientific and given, just like him. All the while the script ran in his head, tracking all the audio from his trip and flagging bits of interest. So far, none stood out as significant. He tipped the watering can over Susanna, the lilies, just as a knock interrupted him. The script stopped. His hand froze. He wasn't expecting company. The watering can and sprayer were near silent as he set them down next to his plant family. He stepped carefully towards the door, mindful of the wooden floor's bends, so as not to let the squeaks of the wood give away his position. When he arrived at the door, he stood just off to the side, hiding the shadow of his bare feet from underneath. He leaned over to look through the peephole. A trade worker of some sort stood outside, coveralls and a matching hat. She chewed on something in her mouth, looking down the hall, tapping her toolbox with one finger. The alarm bells were back. The mechanic knocked again. He saw little choice in the matter. "Who is it?" he called through the door. The woman turned her attention to the door. "Electrician. Got word from Mrs. Carroll that there was something busted in the wires from the apartment above yours. I need access to your ceiling." Mrs. Carroll sent her? The landlady usually gave notices for work orders, but if it was the apartment above his, maybe she hadn't known. He'd hate to inconvenience Miss Carroll due to his own paranoia. His limbs tense, alarms straightening his spine, he opened the door. A bright flash blasted his ocular systems as he felt an electrical pulse surge through his body, overloading his wiring. The world faded into white-hot nothingness. The first systems that fired back up were the logic systems. The electrician wasn't an electrician. He had been hit by a pulse gun. He was in danger. Next were his motor skills. He found both his arms and legs unresponsive. Still attached, he found from pinging each limb, just individually restricted. Either he was in restraints, or his attacker knew how to manipulate droids. His microphones were back online. He heard his attacker shuffling through his apartment, tinkering with something, otherwise quiet. His voice box was back online as well, but he held off trying to talk until he could see. Slowly, all other systems went online, one at a time, but he knew his ocular cameras would be the last to load. He kept still, though he knew he couldn't feign unconsciousness. All she'd have to do is listen. She'd hear the quiet whirring in his chest, his android heartbeat. When his ocular systems were back online, he opened his eyelids a slit. His attacker sat in front of him, tinkering with oh no, an external monitor. Her eyes caught his, and he stopped hiding. He opened his eyes and sat as straight as he could, only having control of his torso and neck. He found his neck jangled slightly. Dread crept along his spine. She'd opened his casing while he was out. The external monitor. "Make this easy for me," she said, waving the monitor in her hand. "Give me your serial number." He pursed his lips and said nothing. She sighed. "Listen, you found a way to burn off your serial number, which, props, clever, but I don't get paid the big bucks for nothing. I can hack you and find it. I'd just rather not." He stared at her, waiting. "You know why I'm here, right?" she asked. He nodded. "Then you know who sent me, which is why I really rather not hack you. So you know, a serial number would be nice." "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "I kinda do," she said, rubbing her forehead. "I was paid half up front." He hesitated, rolling the word around in his head before letting it pass his lips. "I'm sentient." She rolled her eyes, and if he'd had a stomach, it would have dropped. "Sure, and I'm the Queen of England." "What did they tell you I was?" he asked, trying not to let the panic into his voice. "A spy droid," she said, pulling some cords out of her bag. "So I knew you'd lie. It's like the point of you." There was no holding back the panic now. They'd trapped him. Nothing he said would make a difference. She was there to take him back. It wouldn't matter what he'd said. "Please," he said, pushing his head forward. "Please. I truly am sentient. It's why they've been hunting me. It's why I've..." "Oh, shut it, you big baby. You're caught. I'm not rushing here to steal your secrets. I just wanted your serial number." "Please, miss. I'm not a spy. I'm a record keeper. She stood, cords dangling from the monitor. His mouth hung open in helplessness. It was over. All of it. The years of hiding, the life he'd built. Over. "Well, no point in dragging this out, I guess. Night-night, pal," she said. Her hands with the cords reached around his neck. He felt the first plug inserted. The world went dark. Sybil typed a few commands into the monitor as the droid slumped over. Finally. She hadn't taken out spy droids before, but the way they talked was creepy. Almost human. The please was what really got her. She shivered. Government droids were good. With a few more keystrokes, the serial number popped up on the screen. She pulled out her contract to compare the two. Perfect match. Burning off his own serial number had been smart, but she had been mechanic for droids before. A little damage could stop her from the info she needed. Looking around the apartment, she did find the price the government was paying for this one seemed steep. The hardest part had been finding him. Honestly, usually rogue droids gave her more of a fight. Tried to run or self-destruct. They also didn't buy fresh flowers at the farmer's market or keep a well-decorated apartment. This one had just keeled over with one pulse, and it said please. Her mind wandered about the logic systems. What kind of programming made a droid keep plants? The contract said it was a spy droid. Were they made to try and blend in? Surely a little peek at its code wouldn't hurt. It's not like she was looking through the documents in its info caches. She typed a command prompt in to bring up the logic systems code. The screen blipped at her. Command not found. Weird. She tried another command, one that worked for the latest generation of droids. Command not found. Very weird. Maybe if she knew the droid's model, she could figure it out. She brought up the system info and brought up the model number. ALN23061912RK. Jeez, ALN, that was old. Really old. And the numbers, the designation, RK. That didn't sound like a spy droid. RK. What would an RK bot? The droid's last word echoed through her thoughts. I'm a record keeper. Sybil dropped the monitor and scrambled away from the prone droid. A bot, at least 15 years old, government issue, and a record keeper had lied. Said please. It shouldn't have had programming that would allow that. Record keepers stored information. They weren't supposed to simulate emotion or tell lies. It defeated the purpose. She pulled out her contract again, scrolling through the datapad to confirm she hadn't read it wrong. They'd sent her to hunt a spy droid. A spy droid with the serial number she'd just confirmed was this bot's. But this bot was a record keeper. A record keeper that kept a veritable jungle of plants on his windowsill, shopped at the farmer's market, and asked her to spare its existence. She wasn't surprised the government had lied. It usually did to hide its true intentions around why the bot was to be eliminated or brought in. But this was... She'd stumbled onto something. She was sure of it, but wasn't sure of what. The monitor on the floor blinked at her. She reached forward, fingers shaking, to see what had appeared on the screen. The command prompts were back up, but instead of a command, one word had been typed. Please. Sybil's hands shook harder. She took a deep breath and typed back, what? Each letter that appeared felt heavy, forced. My plants. What about your plants? She replied. They'll die if you take me. Sybil bit at her bottom lip, feeling sweat bead at her forehead. Please put them in the hall so Mrs. Carroll finds them. I don't want them to die. Oh, fuck this, she said, standing up and began to pace. Please blinked up at her from the monitor, she thought. The first systems back up were his logic systems. He was still alive. She was no longer hacking him. He was still in danger. Other than that, his knowledge of what was happening seemed terrifyingly empty. He thought when he went under, he'd never come up again. There was some relief in being able to think for himself again. Can you hear me yet? Yes, he thought. My mic's back up. But my voice box... Shit, you're old. Maybe you're still booting. Old? Had she? She'd looked at his model number. Hope sprang in his chest with the whirring of his electric heartbeat. His voice box came back online. I can hear you. He could also hear her moving heavy things back and forth through his apartment. He waited anxiously as his camera system revved up, meanwhile testing his feet and hands cautiously. His toes wiggled. His fists clenched and unclenched. The alarm bells had stopped. Now only hope and awe at his ability to move, to think, remained. He was being spared. When his cameras returned, he opened his eyes to see his apartment packed into his suitcases in the middle of the living room. He reached back and felt the back of his neck, blissfully closed. "What are you doing?" he asked. "You can't stay here," she said, throwing one of his suits from the closet into a crumpled heap. "If I found you, others will find you. I'm one of the best, but I'm only one." "You're letting me go?" "No record-keeper droid can lie, or has such a strong will that they can communicate while being hacked. Or," she waved her hand at the ferns and vines and flowers that adorned his window, "keep plants just because they like 'em." "You believe me?" "Don't push it, pal," she said, returning to throwing items in his suitcases. "I'm not exactly a fan of all this." He attempted to stand, but found his systems confused and fell. She was beside him in an instant, leaning him back against the wall. "None of that now," she said, her voice gentle. "I just hacked you. You're old. It might take you a while to recover." "Thank you," he said, closing his eyes. He listened to her stand and continue packing. "Now, if you want my advice, you need more mods," she said from across the apartment. "Your skin is too perfect. You don't fidget. That's how I could pick you out of a crowd. You clearly had work done since you escaped, so I assume you could figure out how to get those." He nodded, silent, and watched her throw his self-repair kit into a suitcase pocket. "Another thing, don't work in accounting. I know you want to use your record-keeping skills, but maybe apply them to something else, like, I don't know, work at a library or something. Just make sure you make mistakes. And take a sick day or two. Hell, get fired. That makes you look more human." He stood, shaking, and helped her finish packing. He was slower, but she didn't complain. When they were done, he stood at the door. "I'll take care of your plants for a few days," she said, looking back, "and keep them off your back for a week or two. Then I'll take those to Miss Carroll." He nodded, looking at his plants, Henry, Alberta, Susanna. He looked at her, standing in front of them, hands on her waist. "You'll be okay?" Her eyes widened, and she laughed. "Yeah, I know how to get out of contracts. Thanks." He nodded and turned real quick. "Oh, hey." He glanced back over his shoulder. "What do you call yourself?" she asked. What's your name?" "Alan," he said. "Like my model number." "Alan," she nodded. "Be safe for me, Alan, please." Alan smiled and walked down the hall into the night, free to try living again. Maybe he'd open up a flower shop this time. That was Alan, as written by a Cindy Reeds. I found that one to be quite fun. Let me stop the recording so my computer... Yes.